as he read through the brief summary of economic structures. We do have businesses where everyone in the community pitches in, and all the wealth is distributed equitably. The more labor a person puts in, the more they get paid. But we also have some independent businesses, artists, and that kind of stuff. Like, I'm a contact soldier, and I just pay a fee and credits for my community contributions. They even conned me into paying taxes. Binko shouted from inside of the cockpit of the mech that he was still having fun examining. Yes, Binko and I also contribute to Nishnab community funding, Tarky added in a much more reasonable volume. We have a lovely nest maintained for us on Newport Station, on the second-level canopy overlooking the lake. It is quite picturesque. Oh, you two are gonna love Shkegpiwin. Tense chimed in an inviting tone. Once you get checked in back in Sol system, you should try to find some time to come join us. You should come too, Mia. I'm sure you'd have fun. Speaking of, Tarky interrupted as she and Mia Korva got simultaneous notifications on their communicators. It seems there is a conference request from a representative from the Nishnab Elder Council. A secure meeting room should be ready as soon as you are. Oh, that's cool. Mick's response was genuinely excited. Know who we might be meeting with? Tens? Could be my Uncle Mosh. The Nishnab twirled the end of his long braid while looking off at a well and thinking about the question. But he is getting close to retirement, so it may be someone else. Well, I think we're kinda done here anyways. I really just wanted to show Sarah my new toy. Though there was still a note of excitement in Mick's voice, he did seem disappointed by Sarah's less than positive response. But since she doesn't like it, what are ya even planning on doing with a dozen of those? Sarah finally blurted out the question that had been bothering her. Though she truly could appreciate the fact that there was an honest-to-God alien war mech in front of her, it was the intent behind the acquisition that concerned her. Between the massive thrusters, nearly human portions, and quite nimble appearance, she was holding back the urge to ask to try it out. However, the vast array of weapon systems, meter-thick armor, and supposed ability to perform independent orbital re-entry implied a less than leisurely in. A full combat system like this could spark a new arms race in Sol, and her employers would be incredibly angry if she didn't at least try to acquire information on, or a functioning example of one. I was thinking 5v5 team? Deathmatch with non-destructive weapons. Mick answered without a hint of sarcasm or deceit. Like an IRL video game. There was a split second of silence as everyone processed what Mick had just said before each person shouted their response. You're a right fucking idiot. Surely you can't be serious. You're joking, right? Though all three women had their own reasons for their own responses, Sarah, Tarky, and Mia Korva were all completely dumbstruck by that statement. Oh, that's awesome, Tense exclaimed over Binko's wildly growing laughter. I see, these guys get it, Mick stated with confidence as he gestured towards Tens and Binko. Don't listen to those. Tarky made a set of avian's chirps, which didn't translate easily in either Mick or Sarah's translators. Their opinions on cost-efficient expenditures should be ignored. Wait, what'd you call N? Sarah asked while her translator tried to contextualize the term in a way similar to fairy. It's kinda like pahis. Tense tried to clarify. Though the word he used also failed to translate properly. Pais? Mick asked while motioning with his hand to indicate something short. When Tens nodded, in confirm, Mick burst out laughing before trying to explain to Sarah. The old translation is something like little people, but it's basically the same idea as Fae. If I understand the context right, she basically called goblins. Do these goblins occasionally cause chaos as a form of self-entertainment? Miakorva asked in a tone that, to a human, would have sounded like a genuine, forthright question. However, the translators were able to impact the extremely sarcastic context, like jumping out of a 300-meter-high window for fun. Sarah's question was obviously sarcastic. Hey, speaking of which... Tense, said while lightly smacking Mick on the arm with the back of his hand. I understand you may have some concerns about how my people may react to the holographic projection of the elderly man held a deep pain in its simulated expression. Well, let's just call it the history of interactions between your people and those my people consider our kin. Hey, now. Sarah interrupted with an offended expression. That's an American thing. I'm Scottish. We had nothing to do with all that. Yeah, Mick added in her defense. As much as I call Unni tyrants and lump them all together, it's really just the Americans in the Corps who are responsible for the current shit show. And you aren't upset about the... Closing his eyes and breathing in deeply, the hologram of the elderly man, seated in a chair, seemed on the verge of tears for a moment. Of course, I am. Mick quickly added, I don't think it's really possible to move on from a genocide. Is that why you are arming yourselves the way you are? The old man's expression had become much more stoic. However, there was still a deep sadness in his eyes. Though this question wasn't intended as an accusation, it still caused both Sarah and Axika to turn towards Mick to see his response. The private meeting room the group sat in wasn't necessarily small, but the only illuminated area was a small space extending from the round conference table. The meeting between the humans of Saul and a representative of the Nishnab only included the Quistar Admiral at the request of Mosh. However, he did not need to elaborate why, with the conflict in the Sol system becoming more widely known. There were real concerns from both the GCC military command and the Nishnebi government about how this would play out. I mean, having a big stick and being willing to smack people with it can keep them off your lawn. Mick quipped with a smile. I fucking knew it. Sarah quickly retorted. Real-life video games, my ass. Nah, I was being serious with that. Mick rebutted in a way that translated to Axika and Mosh as being genuine. Call me a dreamer, but I think I got a solution that could buy us enough time to actually work out our differences peacefully, Mick. Sarah's tone was almost condescending. Don't be naive. Let's hear his plan. Axika came to the Martians' defense. Though she did want to personally gauge likelihood of needing to act as peacekeeper once arriving in Saul, Mick also reminded her Tens. And if he says something stupid, I will be the first to say so. Thank you, Axika. I appreciate that. Mick replied with a half laugh. And as long as his plan isn't to try to hire Axika's fleet to conquer Earth, Mosh chimed in with a sense of relief in his voice. It can't be that bad. Oh yeah, nah. Speaking of which, Mick directed his attention to Axika with a smile on his face. What was the split from that devourer bounty? 10 quintillion credits, split evenly between the parties you choose to represent and the parties my fleet represent. Axika replied, while pressing a few buttons on her tablet, lying on the table. And it seems your galactic banking account information has already been processed. That's what? What? 10 with 18 zeros after it? The shock of remembering that Mick was now the richest human alive hit Sarah hard enough to make her completely forget about the potential for war. You could just buy out every major corp on Earth with that much. That's the backup plan, Mick said, with a wide smile growing across his face. Right now, I'm setting aside funds to aid with Kaimayak. Resetting effort. Setting some aside as a gift for the Nishnade. Oh, no. Mosh interrupted in the sweet, affectionate tone of a grandfather. You don't have to do that. As much as I and my people appreciate your thoughtfulness, we wanted to be the ones to bestow gifts upon you. What I did was an achievement for all of humanity. We all share it. Mick's declaration brought a smile and hint of true happiness to the elder's expression. So, yeah, really are just gonna try to buy them off. Sarah still held disbelief that Micah would even propose something like that. Well, assuming they're willing to play ball and actually negotiate with us on equitable terms, Mick said with a shrug. Like, there's so much potential for profit in this that they'd be stupid not to at least pretend to get along long enough for cooler heads to prevail. Who are you, and what have you done with my anarchist, revolutionary ex-boyfriend? Sarah's sarcastic tone was enough to allow the translators to impart the joke to the non-English speakers. I just don't want people to suffer, Mick solemnly replied, while rubbing the biological to synthetic transition on his shoulder. The less people that get hurt, the better. Ed Banavine, though the word the elder spoke had the simple translation of love, in the context of loving others as one would love themselves. The more complex explanation was even more empathetic. How much are you planning on offering them? Axika asked while Sarah was still trying to process that Mick wasn't hell-bent on crushing the corporations. Well, I could literally just put 10 years' worth of GDP into the market at once and crash the whole economy. Mick laughed, though more at the absurdity of such an action than any intent of making it happen. Or like Sarah mentioned, I could just buy out the majority shares in all the major core on Earth, and I'd control about a quarter of UNE. And ya think they'll just let ya do that? Sarah still wasn't entirely convinced, though the prospect of entirely avoiding war was starting to give her hope. Well, no. Mick's smile was still wide on his face. But those are plans B and C. Plan A is to make them an offer they can't refuse. Cores are at the limit of wealth they can extract from the current system. They need access to more resources if they want to keep profits up for their investors. And you plan to offer them quick and easy access to those resources. Mosh interjected, already knowing where this was going. Assuming they're willing to give some concessions. Mick's wide smile grew even wider. Marsgov retains full, sovereign autonomy in perpetuity. All interstellar colonies must have civilian governments with the power to regulate and control corporate interests, and native nations get some goddamn land back. Though he got himself worked up a bit at that last part, the demand seemed reasonable to everyone present. And in return, they'll have so much money, They'll drown in it. Sarah was dumbstruck at this plan. It really was dead simple, seemed viable, and actually might end the running conflict between Uni and Marsgov. There were dozens of concerns and criticisms about this that she wanted to voice. However, she also wanted it to work. In her mind, the corporations were not the pure incarnation of evil Mick claimed them to be. They were just collections of people who use their power and influence the way people do. She couldn't picture any CEO turning something like this down without being immediately fired and replaced by someone who would take the deal. God, I hope this works. She finally conceded while leaning forward, placing her elbows on the table and burying her face in her hands. And what will you do if they're not willing to, as you put it, play ball? Agshika's question caused Sarah's head to shoot up from her hands to look at Mick for the response. Then they won't get jack shit. Mick retorted in a blunt fashion. We'll split the human-exclusive economic zone 3 ways between our governments, Nishnabe, Marsgov, and Uni. And the core will have to compete at a disadvantage for the first time in centuries. There was a hope that when we were reunited, that we would become united as many other species are. Moshe's expression was slightly solemn, though the deep sadness seemed to be replaced by acceptance. But seeing as things are the way they are, what you describe is not the worst scenario I had imagined. I'm sure Uni would try to get you to join them as a member state. Mick stated in a leading way, but you'd probably have to privatize all of your community-owned businesses and let investors from Earth leech off your hard-earned wealth. There it is, Sarah chided with a smirk. And what? You think some of your union leaders won't find a way to get rich off this too? I mean, the Martian human wasn't flustered by the accusation. Rather, he almost seemed to find it humorous. Of course they will. But since they're elected by the workers and can actually be thrown in jail if they do anything illegal or immoral, there isn't the same motivation to screw everyone over. You're full of shit, Sarah rebutted without even thinking about it. I can assure you that, despite our longing to be reconnected with our kin, we will not tolerate inequitable trade deals or treaties. Mosh assured them with a confidence that put a smile on all of their faces. Good, Mick commented with a gusto. Don't make the same mistakes my ancestors did. Don't worry about that, the elder replied with a hearty chuckle. We already have stringent visa and immigration processes in place. Smart. Sarah commented, while Mick joined Mosh's laughter. Wish my ancestors did that with the bloody English, she added half-jokingly. There was a sense of peace in the room, as the 3 humans all shared in a moment happiness, even though each of them came from very different places and had come into the room with very different expectations of what would happen. They were all now smiling. The burdens of the old man, the concerns of the young woman, and the anger of the young all seemed to fade as their laughter slowly faded. As the room fell silent again, they had all come to terms with what they hoped would be the best and worst-case scenarios for their respective people. I must admit, Akshika broke the silence before it could get awkward. This gives me hope that this job will just be a simple delivery mission. Peacekeeping for Deathworlders is never easy and not something I was looking forward to. Nah, Gabe wouldn't let us get too far out of hand. Sarah commented. Ah, yes, the independent AI operating in your star system. Akshika's tone dropped slightly while remembering the other issues she would have to deal with. And how exactly is he maintaining the peace in your system? Well, peace is a relative term, Admiral. Mick had a coy smirk on his face. You could say that Gabriel forced the gentleman's agreement on us. A bunch of rules of what we could or couldn't do to each other. Acceptable targets, means and methodologies, no nukes, that kind of stuff. But how does he enforce it? Akshika tried to clarify her question. He's a fully conscious and sapient AI. He can just sort of do stuff. Sarah tried to explain. He can basically access anything with a network connection. His only real limitations are the bandwidth on his central processors and networks he's passing through. That includes orbital and station defense systems. And no one has tried to stop him? Akshika couldn't help but ask. Honestly, not really. Mick shrugged while he replied. A few groups have, but all the major political players actually appreciate having a scapegoat to point to and say, he's the one preventing us from doing the dumbass shit we told you we would do. Gabriel's been at it for almost 40 years now. He doesn't care what he gets blamed for as long as humanity doesn't wipe itself out. There's a whole division on Gibraltar Station dedicated to trying to break in his code and systems. Sarah admitted, while letting out a light chuckle as she continued. Gabe randomly triggers the fire alarms in their command center just to keep EM on their toes. Speaking of particularly annoying AIs, the hologram of the elderly man interrupted while leaning over as if someone was speaking into his ear. Mazer is reminding me of my duties elsewhere. We are handling the preparations for the welcoming fleet, and we needed to know if we should be arming peacekeepers as well. Hopefully that won't be necessary, Mick quickly rebutted, though there was a hint of doubt in his voice. But it wouldn't hurt to bring a reasonable security detachment just to be safe. I doubt it will come to that. Sarah tried to reassure despite the doubt in her own mind, but it really wouldn't hurt to stay well protected. I see. Mosh replied while slowly nodding his head in understanding. We obviously won't enter your system until we are invited in by one or both of you governing bodies. But I believe our fleets should arrive a few days after you do. Until then, feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. With a quick nod, the hologram faded away. The first contact drones should be entering your home system within the next 2 days. Akshika took the Elder's exit as a sign to end this meeting. If you have not done so already, it would likely be a good idea for you to compile reports for your respective governing bodies. I'm not even sure I'd know where to start. Sarah let out a long sigh as she leaned back in her chair. I'd start with how they sent you on a suicide mission with bad intel. Mick joked as he stood up from his seat, and the lights surrounding the table began to expand to fill the rest of the room. But I gotta go work on my report. Let me know when you're done or want to take a break. We'll go grab a drink at that place Tens was trying to tell me about. The Gardens of Deathworlders, Part 11. Harder, Sarah called out through labored breaths. Harder. Already intense pressure became even heavier as Sarah's vision was getting close to blacking out. The woman's entire body was straining against what felt like over a dozen times her own body weight. Just as she felt herself reach the very limit of what she could endure, a small orange indicator in the corner of her eye began to flash. Though the VR simulator had triggered the safety limiters and was releasing its artificial hold on her body, Sarah could see why TENS liked them so much. Well, TENS's voice came like a slightly dulled, transmitted voice in Sarah's ear. I'm impressed. 122. Sustained for a second, with a 10th-second jump to 160 before the limiters kicked in. This is way better than any sim we have. The excitement in her voice made her thick Scottish accent difficult for TENS's translator to interpret the words. Is that what an actual drop feels like? I mean, you have been through re-entry onto an extremely gravity world before, right? TENS asked. Earth, yeah, I guess. But it's nothing like that. Sarah's excited tone was slowly calming and becoming more understandable. We only pull 2, maybe 3 Gs at most. 20 to 30 meters per second squared from orbit to the surface in an extreme gravity? Well, TENS replied with a hint of doubt. That feels low for some reason. Well, it does take over a half hour to get down. This response was much more understandable as the ginger's adrenaline rush began to wear off. And getting into orbit usually takes a bit longer unless you're usually a vertical booster. Huh, interesting. TENS's voice disappeared for a moment while Sarah laid silent and let her body recover from the adrenaline. Before long, the man's almost sing-songy voice came back in. Anyways, calibration is complete. I'm gonna load you into a basic drop scenario. But to answer your question, no. Actual drops are very different. This will be a lot closer. Before Sarah could say anything, the virtual environment she was in began to shift. Though she was consciously aware of the fact that her body was resting flat in a gel-like substrate, and she was wearing some sort of neural interface helmet, it felt like she was in the cockpit of a single-seat void fighter craft. As the almost lifelike simulated cockpit began to melt away, the sensation was like fading out of one dream and into another. Rather than almost laying out in a long, capsule-like cockpit, it suddenly felt as if her body was curling up into the fetal position, while the controls and instrument panel faded from her perception. For a split second, a strange sense of calm washed over Sarah, as all of her neurons were stimulated in such a way that made her feel like she was being embraced in some sort of warm, gentle hug. For a moment longer, she still saw nothing but black, as the hug was being replaced by something far more restrictive. A natural instinct pushed at her mind, and she tried to kick out with one of her legs. While her real-life physical leg only twitched slightly, her perception was that an impossibly tight force was holding her simulated leg in a curled position. She then noticed her arms, hands, and fingers were all likewise being restricted. Panic slowly started to creep its way into her mind just before something new began to pop up in her vision. Sorry about that. I should have warned ya. TENS's voice popped back into Sarah's ear. Those scene transitions can be weird if you aren't used to them. Why the hell can't I fucking move? The tone of her question implied a slight amount of distress, as the basic grid lines of a heads-up display formed before Sarah's eyes. The mech is in lockdown before drop. Just as TENS began to explain, a text box which read "System Activating" was projected against a screen in front of Sarah's face, with her mind being carefully manipulated by a mixture of hypnotizing lights and magnetic neural stimulation. The simulator made it feel like she was now wearing an augmented reality. Her body was braced into a combination seat, full body harness, and she sat inside of an incredibly cramped cockpit. Like I mentioned earlier, you control it through a mixture of thought, muscle movements, and certain active controls. It'll feel surprisingly natural once you touch down and start moving around. How can this possibly feel natural? I'm all balled up and can't fucking move. The doubt in her voice was obvious, even though Sarah felt the panic start to subside. The sync hasn't finished yet. Tense responded. Long story short, combat mech controls work just like the sim. This is just what it feels like right when you first load into the mech. As he spoke, computer code began to scroll on the front panel of the simulated cockpit. What had looked like polymer paneling was quickly covered with a realistic holographic display of the simulated environment outside the simulated mech. Now, are you ready to go diving? Yay. Just as quickly as Sarah responded, she felt a jolt run through her body, akin to downward acceleration. The interior of the industrial-looking room being displayed on the inside of the mech disappeared as the machine fell through the simulated floor and was ejected through the hull of the simulated ship. A planetary horizon quickly came into view through the display before Sarah was once again rocked by the force of deceleration. The simulated effects of powerful retro thrusters pressed into her body as she could see a rainbow of shimmers start to appear on the displays surrounding her. For just a moment, it felt like her skin was cold before it suddenly warmed up as the fires of re-entry started to burn around her, even though she still felt like she was tightly bound in an uncomfortable position. It also felt like she was falling through space. You'll start feeling the suit as if it were an extension of your body. Tense's voice came through slightly muffled, as if Sarah really were receiving a transmission while in the process of re-entry. The arms and legs will unlock once you're closer to the ground, but you can lean around to control your descent. Yeah. No, yeah, I really should have a class for this. Sarah's voice strained slightly due to the pressure her body was under. As she tried to lean herself side to side, the simulated mech began shifting its direction of fall in harmony with her movements. I mean, there is one. Tense replied with a hint of laughter in his voice. But classes are boring and it's better to learn through doing. Oi, ya naff bastard. Sarah blurted out with a grunt, despite being annoyed at the lack of proper instructions. Tense was right about the control scheme being incredibly intuitive. Here's the parts you need to know. Tense conceded with a chuckle. Top left of your HUD is energy, shielding, and armor levels. Bottom left is all your active modes, ammo counts, and weapon conditions. Bottom right is your orientation, acceleration, velocity, and posture display. And finally, are ya shitting me? She couldn't help but start chuckling to herself as she realized what this reminded her of. It's got a mini-map and everything. This is just a video game. Even though the pressure on her chest was making breathing a bit difficult, she couldn't help but let out a sincere laugh. The heads-up display was oriented in a way that granted the pilot an unobstructed view of the center and 4 primary directions, while leaving all relevant information just within one's peripheral vision. Though Sarah had never been much of a gamer, she could immediately recognize this general style from dozens of popular video games. Despite the awkwardness of her posture and the pressure bearing down on her. The familiarity of what she saw brought a sense of comfort to her mind. Yes, actually, it is from a video game. Tense's voice came through with a full-blown laugh. Someone wanted a real mech that could do independent re-entry like they saw in one of our games. But since there wasn't one on the market, a group of us got together and tried to make one. Then military command got involved. About 13 years later, here we are. Wait, do ya mean these aren't a thing in every species military? Sarah was genuinely shocked at Teen's implication. Even if these weren't really cost-efficient systems, she could still see how it would be a good idea to have this kind of capability. A lot of species don't even really have a formal military. Tense responded with only a hint of laughter remaining in his voice. And even if they did, most just couldn't handle acceleration forces like this and stay combat effective. Oi, what? This is only 2, maybe 2.5. Geez, though Sarah could feel her body was much heavier than it should have been. She had experienced far rougher forces than this. 25 meters per second squared, yes. Tense's laughter had completely faded by this point and was replaced by a tone of slight confusion. And that's with compensators fully maxed out. The mech is pulling closer to 70. Well, if it can be compensated, Sarah's tone implied a question. The silence in her ear implied Tense wasn't able to see where she was going. Why can other species handle it? Oh, Tense burst out a bit too loud in her ear. That unit of acceleration you're using is based on Earth's gravitational force. My translator wasn't giving me good context on that for some reason. You gotta remember, standard gravity is only 4ns2, and most species evolved on planets with less than 7. This could be like 6, maybe even 7, for some species. When you put it like that. Sarah's voice trailed off as she thought about what it would be like to pull that many Gs for this long. As she glanced down and to the right, her head unconsciously followed her eyes, and she felt something in her neck click. While the HUD showed the mech was decelerating at just under 7s, it also showed the inertial dampening system had reduced that load to just over 2.5. What fascinated her more, however, was the fact that she could now move her head around to get a better view of her surroundings. Though her neck felt slightly stiff, as if she were straining against an unseen force, Sarah was relieved to finally be able to move at all. You're going to be touching down in less than a minute now, so your movements are starting to unlock. Tense's voice came through again after a moment's silence. The sync is complete, so you're going to feel like you are the mech. Yeah, mentioned that already. So when am I? Sarah cut herself off as a timer popped up on her HUD, informing her of time till touchdown. Never mind. As she tried to push her head lower to see where she would land, it took her a moment to notice something was strange. It wasn't until Sarah consciously recognized she was looking through her own body towards the displays underneath her that she realized she hadn't been able to see her body through the helmet this entire time. However, as soon as the thought of looking at her body crossed her mind, she could see the vague outline of it filtering through. As soon as Sarah's mind wrapped around the concept of conscious controls, she made the outline of her body disappear and had it replaced by the body of the mech. With this new perspective mode activated, Sarah could see that the mech she was piloting was locked in the exact same fetal position she was. Just as she could see, the simulated ground coming at her fast. Her body was rocked by a final jolt. In a flash, the suit had come to an almost complete halt relatively to the ground, and Sarah felt all of her limbs suddenly become free, stretching out wide with relief, and then quickly returning to a more braced position for impact. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The sudden thud as she felt her feet impact with and slightly sink into the ground was deeply satisfying. That was immediately followed by the sensation of a massive weight detaching itself from her back, and she heard a thump behind her. Even though she still faintly felt like she was both laid out flat in the simulator pod and curled up in a ball in the cockpit of a mech, she now also felt like she was standing on an alien planet. "What do ya think?" Tense's voice was coming through a bit more clearly now. Not too shabby. Though she obviously tried to hide it, the tone of Sarah's voice gave away how much fun she was having. "So what? Now I just..." Sarah cut herself off once again as she tried to bring her hand up, and saw the mech's relatively humanoid appendage move vaguely, like how her biological one would have. After taking a moment to examine the movements of her mechanical hands and arms, she slowly took a tentative step forward. She could feel how the mechanized walker had a relatively limited range of motion in comparison to her own biological body, but not in an unnatural way. Though each movement felt smooth and powerful, the rigidness of the frame and limited mobility of the joints hindered dexterity. In Sarah's mind, the sensation was almost like wearing a somewhat restrictive and bulky suit of armor. "It'll take a little bit of getting used to, but you're doing great so far." Tense did sound relatively impressed, though not to the degree that he would consider offering her a job on her first day. "Yeah, pal, not gonna lie, I like it." Sarah couldn't hide her excitement anywhere as she was practically giddy at this point. "Now where are my..." Just as the question began to cross Sarah's mind, the small icons showing the suit posture and weapons got slightly larger and more centered in her HUD in order to indicate where the weapon were. "I just picked the simplified loadout," Tense explained as Sarah tried to interpret the icons. "For offense, you got microcluster missiles on your shoulders, a wrist-mounted laser and kinetic weapon system for your left, and piezoelectric macro hammer for your right." "Wait, did you just say hammer? As in a hand hammer?" Sarah was shocked as she reached down to her side and found a large mass of metal, obviously meant to cause serious devastation, slung to her mech's right thigh. "Oh yeah. You'd be surprised how effective those are against shielded bulkheads," Tense replied in a way that implied he had a lot of experience in the matter. "And on defense, you've got dual-layer, full-body shielding, and concentrated projectors on your left forearm, both shoulders and on your back." "Yeah, I'm still stuck on how this could be an effective weapon in modern combat." Sarah's tone had become fairly skeptical as she pulled the weapon from its resting position and brought it up. An impulse came to her mind to squeeze the handle and just give it a light swing motion. Upon doing so, the handle section of the weapon extended, the head expanded, and her HUD indicated the weapon was charging up. "Oh." With another flick of the simulated mechanical wrist, a line of electrical energy moved from the tip of a spike on one end of the head all the way to the wide, flat surface on the other side. Curious about what it would do, she let the hammer slip in her grip until the head almost hit the ground. The impulse to smack this thing into the ground was now too great for her to resist. With a wide arc, she brought the hammer up and then back down with as much force as she thought she could muster. The results of this action was, however, not what she was expecting. As the hammer impacted the ground, an area nearly 3 times the size of the head, lit up as massive electric discharge, grounded itself. A small area of the ground was completely vaporized and converted into so much energy that it rocked the hammer back up, and Sarah's mech body was suddenly surrounded by a bright, shimmering light. The explosion and debris caused by the impact on the ground had resulted in the active shielding of the suit lighting up to protect it from damage. Careful, that thing packs quite the punch. Tense seemed to be holding back laughter. Does Mick already know about the thunder hammers? Sarah asked with a mixture of sheer excitement and a hint of professional annoyance that implied she already knew the answer. He called them the same thing. Tense didn't bother holding back the laughter now. Whoa, out on the long table. The plethora of delightful smells were making the decision even harder for her. Seeing hundreds of different dishes laid out like this was quite a sight to behold, even without the unfamiliar recipes being displayed. The exotic smells and sights made her mouth start to water, slightly in anticipation. There had already been a few people who had taken some portions here or there, and few more who were in the process of taking their own. However, there was more than enough to go around for everyone present at this particular buffet. Being a far less formal affair than usual, no one was trying to pull seniority or enforce stringent lines and order. However, everyone present still maintained respectful spacing while taking their food. Yeah, I only recognize a few things, Tense commented while standing next to her. He pointed to some corn and rice to clarify. I see some melanin and nominin, but I don't recognize most of the varieties. Take as much or as little of any of it that looks good to you. Mick tried to soothe their debacle as he approached after noticing the pair standing and staring for a minute without grabbing anything. And I won't be offended if you try something and decide you don't like it. If I may ask, Aksika replied in a far more familiar tone than she had taken with this man previously. What are these red berries? They remind me of something native to my species' homeworld. Those are strawberries, Mick replied with a smile and a nod. Domainin in the modern Earth-Mars version of Nishna Benoit. The small dish off to the side with the on per person sign are my special experiment to make them taste like they're dipped in chocolate. Chocolate? The blue woman asked. Oh, you're gonna love that. Speaking on which, Tenz interjected while glancing down the table to see if he could see any of the deep brown delicacies that had been described to him. I didn't have all that much on my ship, and it's incredibly hard to synthesize, even for your production systems. Mick explained, so I worked it out with Tylon to use it as an ingredient for deserts to help spread it out more. Y'all are serious about equity, and I can really appreciate that. Well, of course, Akshika replied with a smile. A well-cared-for crew is an efficient and effective crew. They all work incredibly hard, and so I do everything I can to ensure they're more than adequately rewarded for their labor. You gotta actually convince her she deserves special treatment. Otherwise, she gets kinda upset, Tense commented with a wink, and wrapped one of his arms around the Admiral's relatively narrow waist. I was told this was an informal but highly important form of cultural exchange for your people, Akshika added, while wrapping her large muscular arms around Tenz's shoulder and leaning over slightly to tap her chin against the Nishnabe's head. and that it would have been rude to refuse. Yes, incredibly important, Mick replied with a hint of sarcasm. The wholesomeness of the affection being displayed forced a genuine smile to his face. However, before he could say anything else, he noticed a bush of curly red hair out of the corner of his eye. Don't let him lie to you, Sarah interrupted from the other side of the banquet table as she was starting to load up her plates. This is just an excuse for him to show off his cooking. You know you love it, Mick retorted with a chuckle. Sarah, however, did not dignify him with a response, as she used a pair of tongs to grab a few fried fish fillets and a pile of thick-cut, crispy fried potatoes. Well, is there anything in particular you'd recommend? Axika asked Sarah with a light hint of laughter in her voice. Or not recommend? Her laughter picked up a bit. Honestly, Sarah paused as she looked down the table and tried to see if anything jumped out at her. The curry and mud bugs might be a bit spicy, but it all looks really good. Mud bugs? Tense replied with a mixture of confusion and disgust. Crawfish, Mick replied to try to calm his nerves. They're a mostly aquatic species of crustacean. Make a real mean broil, I tell ya what. He really played up his southern drawl on that last part. I see Tarky and Binko really like them. Axika pointed towards the pair of lovebirds sitting at a perch-like table, specifically designed for their anatomy. Just as the rest of them looked over, they were treated to a display of Binko, expertly cracking open and removing the rear portion of shell with one motion, and then pulling out the meat and innards out with his beak in another motion. Damn, Grandpappy'd be proud of that, Mick commented, while the women winced slightly at the bird's less-than-calf eating habits. Tarky, however, unknowingly demonstrated to them a more polite and mannered method of eating the creature that was far less off-putting. Oi, Sarah remarked toward Mick while looking back towards him. Where's the ice cream? Oh, it's over there. Mick turned toward a second, smaller table over by the far wall of the relatively large room as the redhead gingerly started walking in the pointed direction. The oddly paired couple standing next to Mick had the same question cross their mind. Ice cream? Nice cream, Tense and Axika asked in unison. Oh, that stuff's the best, Mick replied while rolling his eyes in manner to imply extreme satisfaction. It's a frozen dairy product that can be flavored and have sweets added to it. That's where most of the chocolate went. Dairy. Tense's face contorted slightly as he asked the question and tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something. It's made from milk? Whose milk? Axika blurted the question out with the same confusion and slightly taken aback tone that Tense had. Oh. Mick's reply was drawn out, as his mind slowly came to a realization. Your people probably don't drink milk after infancy, do they? Well, this is gonna sound weird, but... The Gardens of Deathworlders, Part 12. Oi, those gotta be at least 24 hands at the withers. Even though Sarah had already watched dozens of videos on the various Quiztar domesticated ungulates, she hadn't really been prepared for the size of these examples. Mia Corva looked down at her blue hands for a moment, as her translator failed to put hands in the context of a unit of measurement. 24 hands is 8 feet. Seeing the confusion, Sarah tried to clarify. However, after watching the Quiztar woman start looking down towards her boots, Sarah converted to metric. About 4 meters. Sorry, we still have a few weird old measurement systems we use for certain things. Ah, I see. I take it that your domesticated ungulates are smaller than these? Mia asked while looking down towards the shorter woman. With most of the animals still being quite a ways away from where the pair were standing, it was hard for Sarah to get a good look at these creatures. However, what she could plainly see was a massive horse-like body, a somewhat familiar snout, and a long, vaguely rhino-like horn. Their mannerisms and movements, however, almost reminded the human of donkeys rather than horses. The few massive beings who had grouped up together were either in the process of honking, while chasing each other, or engaging in some other form of horseplay. As large as they may have seemed, even from this distance, it was clear that they were even more playful than the horses Sarah was familiar with. I think the Recordshire horse was about 2.2 meters and weighed around 1,600 kilos, so he wasn't much smaller than these. Sarah thought back to pictures she had seen on the wall of her dad's favorite pub. But most normal horses don't get bigger than about 1.8 meters at the shoulders, and 1,000 kilos at most. There's only a few breeds that get bigger than that. Your species judges the height of your ungulates from their shoulders? Though Quiztar's question was more curious than condescending, the tonal difference threw Sarah off. Well, yeah, well. Sarah responded a bit too defensively. It's kind of hard to measure from the top of the head when the length and thickness of a horse's neck can vary a lot. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend. I just didn't know. The response was both apologetic in tone and expression. If it's any consolation, the way we measure our steeds is... Mia's voice trailed off with a hint of disapproval at her own people. The way you measure is... Realizing the mistake in interpretation. But now curious, Sarah tried to prod a bit. Well, it's kind of petty. Mia Corva finally admitted after a moment's hesitation. We measure from both the height of the tallest point on the back and then from haunches to horn tip. It can result in some unhealthy breeding practices to fit a particular aesthetic. Ah, yeah, that makes sense, Sarah quickly conceded, as she didn't want to admit to how humans had bred domesticated animals in extremely unhealthy ways. But these all look really healthy? Ah, yes. The Admiral takes great pride in her honor guard and their steads. The second largest one, the blue, pink, and gold one, is actually from my family's ranch. Mia replied, now with a deep sense of pride in her voice. We've been breeding them for countless generations, and I would say our steeds are among the best and the healthiest. I gotta admit, they're all beautiful. I don't think I could pick a favorite just yet. Seeing the closest living thing to a mythological animal, and her home country's national animal, was making the Scotswoman so giddy that she was struggling to control herself. All she could think about was how she wanted to pet all of them. Are they friendly? Well, they can be. Mia winced slightly and rubbed her shoulder as if remembering an old injury. Keiichito can be very temperamental, especially when they know their size. But as long as you give them the respect they deserve, you should be all right. The pair silently stood for a moment longer at the gate of this quite spacious and well-furnished simulated pasture to simply enjoy the view. They had to travel to a fairly secluded area of amenities sections of the ship and pass a few guarded checkpoints to reach this artificial clearing among the sea of structures. The lifelike representations of trees.